Welcome back. Today I want to walk you through something I've been working on this week, a side-by-side test between Shield 16.0.1 and the new Shield 17.0, focused specifically on the new interpretation layer in 17. For those of you who follow this work, you know that the Shield protocol generates a structured statistical reading on a draw, the Dominion triad, the polarity index, the convergence indicators, all of that. But behind the numbers there is an interpretation layer that takes the raw signal and turns it into a directional reading. Is this draw an affirmation? A caution? Mixed? Silent? That layer is what I redesigned in 17, and I needed to know, honestly, whether the new version is actually better than the old one, or just different. So I built a test. I ran 9 synthetic draws through both interpretation engines, holding the input numbers identical. The only thing that varied between the two readings was the interpretation logic itself. The scenarios covered a strong affirmation, a strong caution, a true mixed signal with both polarities elevated, a clean Dominion convergence draw, a silent or null draw, a small sample affirmation, a borderline draw where nothing crossed threshold, a case where the statistics were strong but the surface text did not really engage the question, and a case where the statistics were strong and the polarity was mixed at the same time. That last set of scenarios is where the differences really showed. The first thing I found is that the old interpretation layer in 16 has a real flaw. The very first decision it makes is whether to call a draw Dominion convergence. It checks whether the DT3 sigma is at least 3 and whether identity, inheritance, and priesthood are all greater than 0. The trouble is, greater than 0 is almost no threshold at all. Any draw with a moderate DT3 and even mildly positive scores on those 3 pentad axes gets routed into the Dominion convergence box, regardless of what else is going on. So in my test, a draw that was clearly a caution, negative polarity dominant, covenant breach z-score around 3, SAM negative also high, got labeled Dominion convergence by the old layer. The polarity was being completely overridden by that early gate. The new interpretation layer in 17 does not have that override. It weighs every input through a softmax, so when the negative polarity is loud, it shows up as a 64% caution reading, not as a triumphant Dominion declaration. That is not a refinement. That is a fix. The second thing the new layer does that the old one did not is handle uncertainty honestly. In the old version, the confidence field was just a relabeling of the intensity tier, high, moderate, or low, based on the DT3 sigma and the Fisher GDI p-value. That tells you how strong the statistics are. It does not tell you how reliably the interpretation itself can be trusted. In the new layer, certainty is calculated from the entropy of the posterior distribution combined with a sample size shrinkage. So when all 4 classes are close together, say, affirm at 31%, mixed at 30, caution at 25, certainty correctly drops near 0. The instrument is saying, the signal contains tension, do not commit. The old layer would have called that same draw moderate confidence mixed polarity, which technically classifies it, but does not tell you how much weight to put on the classification. The third improvement is what I would call subthreshold rescue. Shield draws very often do not cross the z greater than or equal to 1.96 threshold on any single axis. The old layer dumped all of those into the null pattern theme. No dominant signal. The statistical signal is at noise level. Draw does not carry a thematically classifiable pattern. But in real-world life force experiment workflow, those draws often do lean. There is a directional texture even when nothing crosses formal significance. The new posterior surfaces that lean, a 40% affirm reading with a 16% lead margin and low certainty, which tells the seeker, there is a tilt here, but do not bet the farm on the tilt. The seeker now has both pieces of information instead of one. The fourth improvement is the surface text alignment input. The old layer did not care whether the verses actually engaged the question. You could draw 20 verses that produced beautiful statistics, but whose surface text barely touched the question that was asked, and the old layer would still declare high-confidence Dominion convergence. The new layer directly penalizes this. In my test, a draw with strong CCI, strong DT3, and very low text alignment came back as a 62% affirm, but with only 18% certainty, flagged appropriately. For a tool whose entire purpose is reading a textual oracle, the old silence on this dimension was a genuine gap. Now, where does the new layer give something up? It loses theological vocabulary. The old classifier names which kind of affirmation, dominion convergence, blessing stream, segula election, inheritance promise, covenant warning, priestly calling, temporal threshold. The new posterior just says affirm or caution or mixed or silent, regardless of which axes are actually firing. That is a real cost. The dominion triad scenario in my test, identity, inheritance, and priesthood all genuinely elevated together with a 4 sigma DT3, gets labeled dominion convergence by the old layer, which tells you what kind of affirmation it is. The new layer just says affirm. Direction without specificity. I also want to flag a calibration concern. In all 9 of my test scenarios, the new layer returned a low certainty label. The formula caps certainty around 76%, even with a perfectly peaked posterior at n equals 20. With realistic entropy, certainty lands closer to 45 or 50%. That is structurally conservative, possibly too conservative for the draw sizes that are typical in real-life force experiment work. A genuinely clean signal, 75% lead, every directional indicator aligned, still reads low certainty. That risks training the eye to dismiss honest signals as noise. I may rescale the sample size shrinkage in a future version to give the n equals 20 range of fairer hearing. The good news, and this is the practical bottom line, is that I built 17 so that you do not have to choose between the 2 layers. The old classifier is still running. The new posterior runs alongside it. Every analysis now produces both the named theological theme from the legacy classifier and the calibrated 4-class probability vector from the new posterior. That is the right architecture. The 2 layers complement each other rather than competing. When they agree, you have confirmation. When they disagree, that disagreement itself is information. It is a flag that the draw is asking for closer attention than usual. My honest judgment on the merits is this. The new interpretation posterior is the more honest instrument, especially for the messy real-world cases where the old layer either misfired or overconfidently labeled. The old classifier remains more interpretively rich on the clean cases where it triggers correctly. Run both. Read both. Treat divergence as a question the draw is putting to you. That is the testing report for Shield 17.0's new interpretation layer. As always, the instrument lets the words be heard. It is not itself the voice.